peu peur de ce bois. Moi, j'aimais moyennement ce bois. Mais il y avait le bois tout autour et sans doute que c'était pas un quartier de Paris.
Au bois, au bois de Vincennes, il y avait beaucoup de prostituées. Et donc tout autour de la fac, c'était un hasard, hein, si tu veux, mais tu avais en plein jour des prostituées qui étaient... donc en même temps, tu avais le lieu du savoir français, etc., le plus réputé, qui se tenait vraiment au milieu d'une espèce de bordel, quoi.
Bon, si on commençait à rentrer dans le bois, il pouvait se passer d'autres histoires. Enfin, disons que ne serait-ce que...
Okay, so we were having an interesting discussion before about how your work seeks to, in some ways, use the plateau formation in the way that it's structured. Would you like to say a little bit more about how that operates?
Well, the film Facts of Life is structured in 8 plateaus, probably because we had a number of encounters with different students, former students of Deleuze from the period of Vincennes, and each of these encounters was a kind of event, I guess. I mean, a kind of very singular experience. And we felt that it was important to try to express or even produce an impression of the singularity of that encounter, of that space between us and each person, and us and each person and Deleuze, their own encounter with Deleuze, our encounter with them, and that led to a kind of consideration of a kind of a filmic consideration, which was probably linked to kind of a genre in a way, because each person had a particular relation to Deleuze and also a particular relation to us that suggested a different form or a different, almost like a different genre for each person, really. So we ended up kind of traversing different filmic genres with each person.
Yeah, and the question of the plateau came especially in the editing phase. Our challenge was how to edit a film in a traditional filmic form, in a non-linear way.
Yes.
So that's how we started considering that each encounter could represent a plateau, in the sense that it was not a beginning nor an end, but it was something in the middle, and that you could start from any point and reconstruct the film with the different elements.
So that would lead to the work never being, as it were, finished.
Yeah.
And the work being continued by viewers, perhaps.
Yeah, sure.
It's also to do, I think, with a conception that we have of a film as a space or a kind of organization of spaces, and which is similar to a body. And so if we talk about plateaus and we talk about intensive plateaus, we also kind of talk about the body of a film as having different intensive plateaus, such that the film as a body has its zones of, we could say, its zones of tiredness, or it has its zones of speed, its zones where it's aggressive, zones of aggression, of kind of muscularity, its zones of maybe delirium or dream, or how the filmic body is felt. I think this question of the body of a film is quite important for us, because it suggests this idea, as you were saying, that the film is never finished. It's something that one explores and goes around, and in a sense, just like with our own body, we try to imagine what it can do for us, or how we live with the body. And I think the same thing applies to cinema in a way, and it's maybe a question which isn't confronted often, that
Yes.
question.
But as filmmakers, you need also to be aware of the cut and the decision to include particular footage or exclude other footage. So there will be, if you like, a more arborescent element to your work, but you'll be moving between them, between the rhizomatic openness and the arborescent structuring. Am I interpreting that in a way that you see it?
Well, the cut, I think, I mean, we tend to think of montage as something which produces an interval, and the interval, which can be in some cases, a fairly jarring interval between different spaces, is in itself a space, and it's a space where the viewer is kind of invited to enter and to configure their own thought in relation to that interval. I think it's quite important. It was quite important for us that the experience of the film was to constantly be surprised or confronted with a kind of shock, in a way, of what was coming next, rather than to be able to safely predict, but not in any kind of provocational way, but more in terms of this idea of this gap which exists in any kind of process of thought between two things you're trying to bring together.
And I would say in the editing we were really guided by a musical principle.
Yes.
If I have to say what was really kind of, we were following, especially for sound, we had, we worked on the film for about 2.5 years.
Yes.
So we had a lot of archives in terms of rushes of images and also recorded conversations. So when we started assembling the images and the sound, often in a disjunctive mode, we started, cutting and pasting in a kind of musical way, as if we were composing a score, rather than the normal interview style that would keep kind of questions and answers. And we ended up using very little, because it's like it was a question of musical phrases that would compose a score. I think
that's interesting. You seem to be describing a very intensive mode of editing, as maybe elements of delirium at times, that kind of intense feeling of the rhythms of the pieces you're working with, rather than cutting to any preconceived storyboarding kind of structure. Yeah.
And another element was that we were working within a language parameter that was not ours. So for us, what Deleuze's students were saying was really sometimes like songs or sound. We weren't too worried about meaning or about the semantic aspect, but it was really like we were more carried by the sound of phrases, which is sometimes preferable than just being stuck in meaning or...
I mean, I think it's quite important to say that we're carried by the sounds and by... There's a kind of intuitive process in this that is then, and you can reconduct it, to the question of a signifying rupture, or to the ritournelle, or to concepts. But while we're working, we're not necessarily thinking explicitly in terms of concepts. The concepts sort of, they come from a kind of almost, I mean, they're there because you live them. I mean, you live that kind of... So, when the Deleuzian aspect of the film is also the fact that, I guess, I mean, certain types of practice are just, they have a kind of affinity, maybe in terms of method, or a way of thinking that is like that. And I think also, like, another term that we could refer to is the collective assemblage of enunciation,
Yes.
you know, which is a kind of Guattarian term. But the idea, I mean, for us of the film was to create some kind of collective enunciation, but which at the same time was not just a collection of individuals. It was a individual sort of impersonal enunciation, which didn't really belong, you know, individually to this person or this person, but was constantly being sort of relayed between all of these different voices. And because of that, there are certain sort of, Silvia was saying, like song aspects, you know, everybody has their song kind of, in a kind of like Kafka, you know, musician sort of thing, you pick up the phrase that carries the image to something else, you know, and that's I guess kind of the way we think about sound in this kind of non-signifying, not necessarily thinking about what's being said, but the way it's being said, the melody, maybe.
Yes. So you haven't made a film about Deleuze. It's you were saying before, with a feeling with Deleuze, working with Deleuze, and taking the concepts as only part of the process of making, and letting the concepts, as it were, take you into other affective and intensive state of working states, working conditions.
Yeah.
Could I ask you about your ideal viewer, given that you're talking about your own intensive engagement when making the work, and the plateau structure, as it were, opening up gaps where the viewer would be without pointers, without signposts about what would come next. What would be your ideal? I know there's no such thing as an ideal viewer; it's an abstraction, but an ideal viewer for your work. What kind of processes, what kind of engagement would you ideally like your audiences to have?
Well, maybe it's not really an answer, but inevitably you're thinking a lot about the missing people. And to go back to a Deleuzean concept. And so it's very difficult to imagine an ideal public. What do you think, Graeme?
Well, I think that the idea, an ideal viewer, I suppose, I don't think I imagine an ideal viewer, and I sort of imagine what actually happens a lot during screenings, which is that the viewers the real viewers, with whom you can have a real relation as a public, which, I mean, the public is often a kind of abstraction where you don't have any relation with the public at all. So when people talk about things like, we have to be aware of the public, this question, I think, it's very dodgy to say be aware of the public, because one cannot, be aware of specifically the public, because it's like an abstraction to begin with. So the real viewers that we've had come from very, very kind of varied places. They're not just philosophers. They're not just they're sometimes quite people that we wouldn't have predicted would have been interested in a film like this.
Yeah, probably somebody who can live the experience of watching a film like a real event.
Yes.
Probably that's
someone
something.
who can give, as it were, give themselves to
Yeah.
give of themselves to.
Yeah, and
encounter.
and in the various screenings we had, we must say it's very interesting because there isn't really a pattern of a certain type of public that you would say Deleuzean scholars, art house, cinema, cinephile, or I think it's interesting because it's much more transversal. And it's something that happens or not, and it's something that that is not really related to a philosophical background or a cinema background or even a cultural background. But it's been quite surprising for us as well how varied and transversal actually
Yes. Could you say a little bit about the different contexts in which your work has been presented? I noticed, for example, on your website it discussed exposition in Marseille, a more interactive form of presentation of your film, and obviously there are the normal screening events at conferences, the more formal, usual screening events at conferences. So could you say a little bit more about your decision to present your work in a variety of different contexts and methods of presentation?
Do you want to?
Yeah, probably the feeling we had when we started editing the film was that the matter that we were working was kind of constantly overspilling any kind of border we were going to design for it. And not just in terms of the quantity of rushes we had, but it was really a kind of puissance, comment on dit puissance? Power of the matter itself. And when we finished the film, obviously we started screening it at festivals in a kind of more traditional way, but we also had the feeling that the matter was still demanding. It was still, it had a kind of pulsating element that was overspilling the limit of a normal projection. Or so we met, for Marseille, actually we met the director of the festival, Les Instants Vidéo, who got interested in how we could imagine an explosion of the film that we eventually called Explosion. And so the idea in Marseille was a kind of dispersion of filmic elements of facts of life and in different contexts. And so what did we have? We had the...
there was an installation, a multi-part installation in a gallery in which we kind of this idea of redistribution or distribution of elements of the film, that we took elements from the film and then we kind of transformed their space, the way they existed in space. So we were interested in how we could transform the perception of filmic space, but also to transform the viewer space as well in relation to that. So to this kind of dual transformation of the spatial encounter with a film, or with film as a kind of a quality of experience rather than as a film. So we had that, and then we had parts of the research archive that went into making the film. So we were constantly kind of expanding the boundary of where the off-screen of the film, what was in the off-screen of the film. And then we had another video installation which was installed in a bookshop, which was from footage of the film that we didn't use.
And it was mainly where there's a section in the film where you see somebody's notebooks from the cinema courses from the 80s. And we used very little in the film, obviously, so we kind of re-edited that, and the installation was on a surface among the books, so that it really looked like a notebook, and people could hear the student who was constantly talking to her notebooks, to a kind of in an interval between
a present and former self, and also to place a kind of ambiguous object like a notebook in a space of published books. In a space, because what we were interested in was the way in which students' notebooks represented to some degree a kind of an archive which wasn't merely a personal archive, it was an archive which had some dubious historical status as well. And that, of course, in the film is related to the video archives that we began working from, which were filmed in the 1970s, but which again have this kind of strange status between public and private record.
Yes.
Yeah. And then we had another element was in a cinema. We screened for 2 weeks every day parts of the original archives that we had seen and that gave us the idea to make the film, but they were refilmed by us in a 16:9 in a letterbox frame. And there was a performance called Plier, déchirer 1000 fois 1000 plateaux, which means
to fold and tear 1,000 times 1,000 plateaus.
Yeah, and basically we were working with a performer friend, Nico, and we were sitting on a table and with a copy of 1000 plateaux, and the idea was to...
Between us we would fold and tear 1,000 times during the performance.
Yeah, and eventually at the end of the festival we did show the film, The Facts of Life. So the idea was also that people who went to the festival walking around the city could gather different elements in a kind of fragmented form, and then they would find, if they wanted the film at the end, that was anyway completely different. So also the idea of walking, because it's like something you said before that we were probably consciously trying to do in the editing of the film, to leave some space for people to walk, to get lost, maybe to leave the film and come back. So the idea of walking, that I think it's present in the edited version, there was more obvious in the idea of walking around the city of Marseille and picking up bits and recomposing the film. Yeah.
So for those viewers, it's likely to have been a very different event than someone seeing it at a conventional screening.
Yeah.
Because it's been a multiplicity of events rather than just a single event. It's been a multifaceted event. And sense of materiality, different kinds of materiality, because there's a sense in which a projected film is an immaterial, mental phantasm. And that, I think, sounds like you were trying to engage them on a variety of different levels.
Well, one of the levels we were trying to, I think, engage people on was to reconfigure the Bazinian question, what is cinema, in terms of where is cinema, which is to say that montage in film became this kind of idea of the extension of of these intervals that montage is, it's intervals that are then become actual spaces where other things happen, and those things are they part of the film in its exploded sense, or are they not? They're almost like a kind of off-screen, where the spectator wanders, in a sense, in an off-screen space between parts of the film. So there's this constant membrane between what is the actual body of the film and what is not. It's constantly being renegotiated, this idea.
Yes. Some of the comments you've been making in the last section of the discussion reminded me a bit of some of the theoretical aspects of expanded cinema and video movement. How far do you regard your work as firmly located within an avant-garde tradition, and how far do you feel that it could have a broader, more popular appeal than, say, a specific art house or artist-based or philosopher-based set of viewers?
Again, I'm referring to, in a way, the missing people. because I think what makes a film difficult or exclusive or even sometimes elitist, is simply a question of habit, meaning that unfortunately people, according to me, are so used to very kind of traditional format of cinema that should have a certain length, certain duration of plans, a certain... It makes it more difficult for films like ours to be considered,
Yes.
say, normal. Our idea is that the film is completely normal. And I like very much a text I read by, there's a Filipino director that we feel very connected to, called Lav Diaz, and he made a film called History of a Filipino Family, and it's a film that lasts how many hours again? 13 hours, and he insists on projecting it in its 13 hours format. And he was asked exactly this question by, I think on the review Senses of Cinema,
Yes.
and he was asked, aren't you worried that your concerns, especially in portraying a Filipino family, are kind of basic, but that your public is so narrow? When we saw the film, by the way, there were 5 people in the theater during a festival. And I really like his answer. He says, well, my film will always be there, and maybe it's just because people are not used to it anymore, so my film can wait. I probably won't be there anymore, but the film can wait. And why not? Maybe we can imagine that in the future there will a time when Godard is shown at 8:30 on Mediaset, and people, families have dinner in their apartment and they just think that it's completely normal. So I don't know if I make sense or not.
I don't know. I think that
Yes.
the question of these categories, I mean, is we pose like these kind of, I mean, you could call them, if we want to go back to kind of Deleuzean terminology, they're molar categories that prevent us from discussing what the real problems and the real questions are in any kind of cinema. So I don't think I see it as a distinction between what you could call avant-garde poetics and the conventions of commercial cinema. What I see are cinema in itself is a kind of problematic field that poses different questions, which are very, very interesting questions about perception, about our experience of what we could call the continuity or discontinuity of experience, the relationship between bodies and images, and those questions are posed in all kinds of films. I mean, they're posed in both in films we would regard as commercial cinema, as they are posed in different ways in films that are labeled for some particular reason as avant-garde or as being or experimental. But I don't think that those things, I think that the same questions are being dealt with in different ways by a lot of different filmmakers working in different fields. I think that we'd ideally, I suppose, like to see the field cleared so that we can see what the actual questions are, rather than having this kind of label which fundamentally doesn't really, it's not very interesting, it doesn't mean very much. All it simply does is enable the marketing or the distribution of films to take place in the context of the economy that we live in, which is to say that there are some films which are regarded for some reason as difficult, whereas ontologically those films aren't difficult at all. They can be very, very simple. The films of Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Huillet, which I mean, if we think about a British context, I imagine have hardly been seen by anybody, particularly younger viewers. They don't circulate very much, but I don't think there's anything particularly difficult about them. In fact, there's something quite disarmingly simple about these films, but the problem is, I think, the way in which these films are filtered by a cultural apparatus, which is a molar.
Yes. Would you ever do anything? How should we say? You might feel might compromise your ideal in some way if it were to share some of the insights you've had with a wider public. Would you do something like use a commercial vehicle of some kind, or a vehicle that you might not be entirely happy with ideologically, if it were to get your work or some images you've made out to a wider public and engage them in some way? Because it's something that worries me a lot about whether it might be worthwhile to, as it were, compromise a little if it could generate a spark that might get people who would never have any kind of engagement with Deleuze, interested in Deleuze in the first place.
The problem is that one engages in a film which is a very long and labor intensive thing to do. You're not consciously thinking about this, you just need to do it. It's not something that you initially imagine for a certain type of distribution or a certain type of public, but that's really what you want to do. And what happens later to the work once it detaches from you and takes its own life, it's even not your problem anymore. I think it's not a conscious decision that
I don't think, for example,
I
don't think we can, at least for the kind of cinema that we are interested in making and that we are making, I mean, now we can't really separate the form that we want to make the film from the idea of the film itself, in a sense that the film comes as a form. Or it's not a story and then we'll write an idea and then think, how are we going to do this? It's more the film comes as one thing almost. It's like there's no a priori separation between the idea for the film and the form it's going to take. The idea is the form, and the ideas come in terms of forms. I mean, fundamentally, I think that cinema is an arena where one invents these kind of mobile forms, which are like a machine. It's like you make a machine that does something, but it does what it does. It's like the machine, it's not a machine which is designed to do something. The machine, in a sense, produces its own purpose. And it produces its own rhythm, and it produces its own form, its own way of being. So that's why we tend to sort of think about the question of the body, and we come back to the question of the body because the body is something which is what we could call discontinuous. It's not, all bodies are different. And if we thought of film more in those terms, then we would, start to think, why does a film have to be like, as increasingly it is, a body which is, completely formatted and disciplined within a certain way, because every body is going to express itself in a different way.
Yeah. And in this I feel very close to Deleuze and Guattari in terms of we don't think of a film in terms of it's good, it's bad, I like it, I don't like it, but what is useful for me? What can I take, and why do I want to take this element or other, rather than saying it's a good film or it's a bad film?
Yes, it's interesting having this conversation with you, because I've thought one or two things about my own work, which is obviously coming from a very different direction, working with film analysis.
Yeah.
But a simple example would be that my book on horror film, because it's a popular genre, I know very well that book has had more readers and will have more readers than the book on more experimental cinema, altered state cinema. And in a way, then I think, well, if more people have got, as it were, turned on to Deleuze and Guattari through that, then I feel perhaps somewhat with very popular, very mainstream film where there are moments of potential richness and intensive moments in an extensive work, rhizomatic moments in an arborescent work, then it would be worth somehow working through those, because within a flat terrain like a mainstream Hollywood film, there might be holes, or there might be precipices, or there might be kernels of something else.
But there always have been. I mean, I think that, you know, in classical cinema, you have, I mean, not to go back necessarily to the auteurist concept, but I think that you have people working in very commercial, let's say, or traditionally what were at the time commercial films, you know, being churned out by studios, who were engaged in precisely those kind of what we could call like borderline question, because I think that again there is sort of this question of the spaces between. I mean, it's clear that, for example, if you look at John Ford, he's as much interested in the spaces between his characters, the tensions which exist in a kind of, you know, underlying level of the molar organization of the society that we see. And because, I mean, as an artist, he enables you to see things which are way, you know, deeper than the identitarian sort of configurations that are imposed by the nascent state apparatus, we call it like that. Or Nicholas Ray, you know, there are these intensive affective things which exist. I think the question is fundamentally where the focus of the filmmaker lies, you know, that you have, you know, people who are interested in those particular questions. They're working in a medium which is maybe heavily policed, but in that case, probably those questions are going to appear to viewers, to certain viewers of the film, and not to all viewers of the film. I mean, in the same way that I could say, you know, I go to see a film, I don't know, a commercial film, and maybe I get something out of it, but I'm still a minority. I'm still in a tiny minority that gets that particular thing out of that film. So the question of what the minoritarian becomings in commercial cinema are not just, you know, it doesn't mean that a mass audience is going to get the minoritarian becomings in popular cinema, because it may still just be a minoritarian becoming in terms of the audience of the film. I mean, we love, I mean, all kinds of cinema. I think that we draw on certain elements of what we could call genre film, but we're also interested in a kind of the taking certain elements and leaving others out, you know, so that there's a kind of index that is a possible reading of an image, but isn't going to, in a sense, dominate your viewing of it. It's just one possible pathway you can take. So there's a sequence, for example, in the film, which is probably the sequence which has been most commented upon in the screenings that we've had and the debates we've had, which is in the woods of Vincennes, where there is an encounter in the woods of Vincennes between, as it happens, a student who spent quite a lot of time in the woods of Vincennes getting out of it, and Silvia, but who is a kind of anonymous figure in the film. And this scene has, I mean, it's generated an incredible amount of different ideas and interpretations, because we tried to keep the field as a kind of open potential field where there are readings which come from the idea, oh, it's like a horror movie, oh, it's like a fairy tale, or it's like Alice in Wonderland, or it's like Straubenwehr, you know. So there are all of those things which come from taking as much out as you put in. You sort of you take certain elements out that would create those binary, you know, rails that was going to, you know, the spectator's going to say, okay, I know what kind of film, I know what I'm watching. I think that for us, images, we're interested in the strangeness of images as a kind of general principle, that images are a very strange thing, and we want to try to explore that sort of, you could even say, primordial strangeness of the image, and to leave it as open as possible and not to close down the pathways.
Very worrying indeed that the current political and economic situation seems to be closing down those kinds of spaces to explore images and to reflect on ideas more and more. In the current climate, how do you see, can you see a way forward for radical aesthetics, such as those offered to us by, you know, work with Deleuze and Guattari? How could they survive? How will they survive? Do you feel optimistic about whether they will continue to have impetus and to spread?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think it's ever been easy to. Well, I mean, one has to also think that cinema, in particular, you could say, is a particularly difficult arena because you're working within a kind of an economic machine that is going to calculate as much as possible, you know, the risks involved in investment in a film, because a film is a big sort of investment as much as anything else. So, but I don't think that that's necessarily going to prevent people from doing radical work. I think that there's still a space. I mean, I think there will always be a space where radical work will be done. I mean, the very conditions in which radical work is done are always difficult, and I think the difficulty itself which makes the work radical to a certain degree. You know, it's the fact of resistance, which is actually part of the process of what you're doing. You're resisting, and that resistance is actually part of the motor which produces the work.
Yes.
You know, so difficulty is something. I know maybe things are going to get more difficult. You know, we are always we try not to think about it because you want to, in a sense, be able to conceive the forms you want to be able to, you know, first of all, and then the rest of it is kind of is a question of resistance. It's a question of finding a path, zigzagging, you know, trying to find ways of getting things done.
And perhaps exactly because things are getting more difficult, that more and more people will try to go back to radical thinkers. And for example, in France, during the past 2-3 years, they are republishing the work of Guattari, and they are republishing books that had been completely how do you say? Forgotten, yeah. Like, for example, last year, Les Années d'Hiver was republished, the Years of Winter, which was a book that had disappeared for many, many years, and it's a book about the 80s. And you could see exactly why there was a sort of urgency to republish that book. And so I don't necessarily think that a kind of more conservative and repressive historical period is going to produce more conservative art. Actually, we could hope that it's, for the question of resistance, is actually the opposite. or it's more complicated than just a kind
Yeah, well, I
of
mean,
mirror.
there's certainly certain periods of what you could call clamping down periods have produced fairly strong responses. And I mean, if we look at, for example, I don't know, the musical underground in the 1980s is an example, you know, with under Thatcherism, which in the supposedly more buoyant and you know, free 90s, you know, wasn't as interesting or certainly wasn't as experimental in the mainstream, or you know, moving towards the mainstream. Now there's a lot of experimental work being done, both in all fields. I think the problem now isn't that, I mean, I think more and more people are doing interesting things. The problem now is visibility and distribution more than production. One can, you know, you can produce really, really interesting things, and you can work with reasonably low budgets because technology is making things more accessible. The problem is distribution, fundamentally, you know, is how to get things seen. So there's a lot of work that is underground in another sense, you know, that is there, but maybe things like I don't know, it's almost a kind of it's a kind of banal thing to say, but I mean that certain networking through internet is making things visible again. And I'm not just talking about new work which is being produced, but also the archive. It's very interesting to see how the kind of films which had a very, very small minoritarian audience through the internet are beginning to, I mean, we could talk about things like Strauss-Bouillet, or we could talk about Jacques Rivette, or we could talk about people who've been kind of marginalized in their own careers and their own lifetimes, that are now, you know, beginning to circulate among, you know, younger publics, and who are also talking a lot about these things, you know. So, and I think fundamentally that work is so strong and so powerful, and that's maybe one of the reasons why it doesn't circulate, because when people do see these things, it's incredibly galvanizing, you know, for them, and it actually, you know, makes people decide to become filmmakers. It makes people decide to do things. You know, I mean, for us, you know, these kind of primordial experiences of difficulty are the most energizing, because they're things which stay with you completely. You know, the shock of seeing the Strauss-Bouillet's films. We saw a retrospective of Strauss-Bouillet's films, was one of the things which made us decide to make films. Or so
you feel optimistic in the power of, as it were, pockets of small initiatives of radical energy, creative energy, could somehow spread further and ignite in social upheaval in a wider sense. You feel optimistic about, for example, the recent events in Paris and the rest of France.
Sure.
Do you feel, does that make you feel optimistic about spreading of radical energy?
Optimistic. Do you feel optimistic?
I don't know. I think it's very, very difficult to understand the relation between social upheaval and cultural production. I mean, and like art, if you like. There is a relationship, but it's not an easy relationship to work out. And I think that there are. It's very difficult to think of a kind of direct influence between, you know, in the same way that people talk about, you know, whether violent films produce violent behavior. You know, we could say, well, does radical art produce political radicalism? I don't think that it's as simple as that. But I think that what it does help to do is produce forms. And so I think that it's necessary, all kind of forms of we talk about forms of resistance. We can basically, I think, talk about resistance of forms. And the resistance of forms it goes beyond what in the short term we're able to think about in terms of, in the future, the next few years, what's going to happen. Because the resistance of forms is it's a much deeper question. The resistance of forms is something which you think about in terms of hundreds or thousands of years. You think about leaps between, when something is actually made and maybe 300 or 400 years, I think in the way that Deleuze conceives of Spinoza is very similar to that. He thinks about the question of what he talks about, the infinite speed of thought, that or the arrow, where the interval between when something is made and when it's picked up and somebody grasps it is completely undeterminable. You can't determine that. And I think that any kind of optimism that we have comes from the desire to make work that is like that. That is not, we're not interested in the short-term gain, if you like, of the work, or the short-term, even for example, our work is greeted often with, the responses are very mixed, but we don't mind. In fact, it's really good that there's discussion or argument, or people take sides about it, because for us that's the best thing that can happen, because it means that something has touched people in some certain ways, maybe in ways they don't particularly want to be touched, and then it creates a kind of field of energy, and hopefully that field of energy will continue or recycle, or but how can you say, because film itself is a kind of, it's paradoxically not a medium that is destined to endure, even less so digital. Digital film lasts even less time than traditional celluloid film. So, we're thinking also, I guess, in terms of a medium that is going to disappear to some degree.
So have some people given you very negative feedback or very challenging feedback to your work? Have you made people angry?
Well, sometimes people leave the cinema, so that's a sign of refusal, it's a sign of... but even that, it could be hard maybe the first time that it happens, especially if you're at a big festival, but I think it's a very interesting sign. It's like it creates anyway a strong reaction, and it's for us extremely interesting. So it's I don't even see it in terms of negative or positive. It's it's a possible reaction.
because it is a possible reaction, because fundamentally, again, to go back to the question of the body, and then like Spinoza, I think an interesting thing about Spinoza is he talks about certain bodies are good for you, and you realize it. In an encounter, you realize that this is good for you, and it helps you. It expands what you're able to do. And certain bodies are either bad for you, or or you're indifferent to them. And I think that it's the same with film, and I wouldn't think of this in terms of judgment, because we're trying to get away from the idea of judgment, more in terms of simply okay, this encounter didn't work for you, but that's not a problem. It's not a problem, because for other people the encounter is extremely strong, and it has a very galvanizing effect. So I don't see why this should be a problem. I think that it's a completely natural state of affairs.
Yes. Could I ask about your future plans in terms of perhaps the next film project we might think about working on?
Actually,
and how that might relate to your previous film, and also to Deleuze and Guattari's ideas?
Yeah, we are working on the development of a new feature film. called Girl from the Nouvelle Vague, and we're now in the process of meeting actors, and we've developed the structure of the film. And in terms of connections with the previous film, well, the Nouvelle Vague, something that was quite interesting when we saw the archives from the 70s. We were still living in Italy, and that's when we decided to move to Paris to look for the people who attended the courses. For us, the archives were already a kind of bizarre Nouvelle Vague, unedited Nouvelle Vague film, and the desire that moved us to meet the people and make our own film was really that latent Nouvelle Vague fictional aspect that we found in the students, in certain gestures, in a certain quality of the image that was already there, wouldn't you say, Graeme?
Yeah, and I think that certain aspects of those images, they made you think of, or they made us think of filmmakers like Jean Eustache or Rivette, or filmmakers we really liked, and the desire to make Facts of Life was actually to sort of take this image, this room of people, and to follow kind of an impossible trajectory or pathway or of the people when they left the room, but in the larger sense, when they left the room and went into their own lives, and therefore, so we discovered those people after 30 years when they had obviously walked a long way from that room,
and if, as you were saying before, in Facts of Life, the key word is with, like it's a film with Deleuze. This new film is a film from, and obviously, Girl from the Nouvelle Vague. It's a fromness.
And we're concerned, I think, in both films about the idea of missing body.
Yeah.
The idea, for example, of how one imagines, when we talked about collective enunciation, how we imagine the collective body, because the collective body was something that after the 68, 68 was the image of a potential collective body, a political movement which came from the streets, from the intersection of very, very different and segregated worlds. And then, of course, things re-entered kind of order, after that. So there was this question in all the cinema of the 1970s about where that body went, and so the films that are quite striking of that whole period are, I think, they're striking for a kind of desertified quality to some degree. If we move from like the films of Rivette, which are about ghosts and phantoms, wandering the streets of Paris on their own trajectories, which seem kind of delirious, but at the same time they are completely contiguous with what he's filming at a documentary level. So there's this question of the parallel life.
Or a film like La Maman et la Putain by Eustache.
Yeah, which is sort of like dissects the whole question of how much relations have changed, and then there's Marguerite Duras, who is somebody as a filmmaker who is horribly marginalized and very, very little seen. I think there's going to be something in London of some of the films she made in the 70s, where that question of the desertification of the image and the removal of bodies, as it were, was taken to great extremes, where she remade the film India Song and took out all of the images of the actors and then replaced them with images of the building where she had filmed, but in ruins. So we're interested in that sort of spectral aspect of the 1970s. I think we tend to keep going back to that. So this film, we're sort of looking at this question again of the missing bodies from the idea of characters in films, and where characters go when the films are over, when the film's finished, and to imagine the missing bodies of characters outside the bounds of the film. So it's really a kind of, we could call it a documentary about characters.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Could I ask a final question
sure.
about your website?
Yeah.
Which I found extremely interesting, and other people I've spoken to also found interesting, in the way that it's organised as an assemblage, a plateau.
Mm-hmm.
How did you come up with the way you structured the website, and how would you like it to be used by its users? Because it must receive quite a lot of hits, I think.
Uh-huh. Well, the original idea was very simple, just to have a blog of the tournage of the film. Actually, that's how we started it.
Yeah, kind of. While it was a work,
It was, yeah.
While it was a work in progress,
Yeah.
we wanted to document the process of making
the
the
actual
film,
shooting
and also the thought that we were going through behind
Yeah.
that process. So each, we defined certain kind of areas that we were interested in, and then the website sort of evolved like that, because
Yeah.
at a certain point in the shooting we were dealing with a specific question, and then so, for example, the question of faciality, for example, which comes up, and how that relates to the what you could call traditional documentary practice. Because we had, and it wasn't even a purely theoretical, idea or a bee in the bonnet that we had. It was simply that when we started making the film, we had perhaps more an idea of making a documentary. But then when we started sort of trying to do some interviews, we found that what we had filmically wasn't interesting. And one of the reasons it wasn't interesting was because the situation of an interview produces a kind of molar personality, of a persona which is already somehow configured, and which people know exactly what they want to say, how they want to present themselves. So the event doesn't take place. There's no real event that takes place in the exchange. So we thought, well, that doesn't really work for us. So we wanted to reflect on why that didn't work, and it seemed that this kind of very, very secure set of coordinates, it made us reflect on what visagété was for us as a power apparatus. And one of the things was this idea that visagété is something which reassures you in terms of identity, that you know where you are. This idea of you know where you are in a structure in relation to other people. So we had this idea that, well, yeah, you've got a face, but it's not just the face. The problem is the face, the name, the history, all of those things which, in a sense, are configured in that way, which produces this kind of, kind of desire to be reassured. When you see somebody who appears, first of all, as a face in a film, in a documentary, you want to know who that person is. I mean, this is a completely natural thing. And so we were thinking, well, but it's interesting also what a face is simply as a figure in a film, that it's a potential figure that can mean lots of different things, and it isn't necessarily closed in by those coordinates.
And in the case of the film, it's also a question of liberating the voice. So another thing that really interested us was how to liberate the voice from
the face.
The face. And, but maybe we're not answering the question of the website.
Well, it was just to give an example of how each bit of the website sort of was constructed. And then when we finished the film, the website also became a way of documenting all of these kind of redistributions, if you like, of the film.
Or creating links to websites that we got a lot of people writing us, asking us to put their website, and so it became also a kind of network.
Yes, and there would be many different paths a user could take in that website, through links and back again and so on. And for my experience of it, that's what I enjoyed, a sense of every time I went on, it would be a different mix. And I thought it was a very effective way of, a complementary way of being an assemblage with your film. As part of the film, but not the film. And again with gaps and with an element of choice and work for the user, rather than a tree, an arborescent tree that you would follow. Okay, thank you very much for your time and for engaging with this interview. I found it really enjoyable and enriching, and I feel I've learned a lot talking to you. I know a lot more about not just what you're doing in your project, but about how film might be used and could be used. Its potential feels like it's opened up in a different direction from talking to you this afternoon. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.